It's an enormous pleasure to introduce Timotheus Vermeulen, the guy of metamodernism. You know him. Is one of the sort of coolest but also shyest art theorists in a country that does not shine for its theoretical bravado. Tim is assistant professor in cultural studies and theory in Nijmegen, Radboud Universiteit Nijmegen, where he also directs the Center for New Aesthetics. He has a very solid, reputable academic set of productions and publications, but he also writes extensively for that strange galaxy called the art world, and Journal of Aesthetics and Culture, Screen, Efflux, Frieze. And in relation to Frieze, Tim and I ventured into one of our riskiest projects, which was an extended interview in which I expressed a certain amount of skepticism, should I say, about the object-oriented ontologist. An interview that I think had its impact, caused a great deal of irritation in the object ontologist camp, and we offered Graham Harman the right of reply when he was here, I think in this very room, not so long ago, with a seminar organized by Maria. Tim and I said, well, you're coming to town, let us have a conversation about our mutual disagreement, and Graham Harman refused. So on top of my long list of criticism of this guy, lack of dialogical honesty is adding the list. So Tim and I do venture out in risky operations, making theory, practice, and politics part of what we do. It's an enormous pleasure to have him here today, and he will have a talk on the Anthropocene, notes on a cultural dominant. Well, he's a bit nervous, so please make him feel really welcome. Tim Vermeulen.
Thank you, Rosie, for that amazing introduction. I am 100% certain going to disappoint all of you immensely, but I do that to myself on a daily basis, so don't worry about that. Also, thanks, Maria, for the invitation. It was very kind. I'm going to read my text, which I tend not to do. I'm doing that because I'm new to the topic. The Anthropocene was something I was always just about to venture into, always something that was on my bookshelves, and I kept thinking I really want to get into this, and then somehow it never really happened. And so when the invitation came, I was very happy because this sort of provided an opportunity for me to start reading into it. But because I'm not entirely sure of where this is heading, generally, but also the next half hour, I thought I should read it to give some kind of structure to the talk. I'm going to speak about art, which I feel might not be a bad idea given that we're in Bach today. So I want to speak about certain developments within the arts that I imagine are related to some extent to the Anthropocene as a structure of feeling, as a mood, as a cultural dominant, as Jameson would say. So, I've changed my title to the far catchier Feeling Anthropocene. I felt this would be a great way to start. I should start this talk with a disclaimer. In itself, this is hardly surprising. I start almost every talk I give with a disclaimer. This is a consequence, I'm afraid, and there's no false modesty here of knowing very little about a specific topic, life, the world, whatever really. But in this case, I guess it's less a question of what I know about the topic that I'm about to speak about than how I know it. I am not a specialist of the Anthropocene by any means. I guess it's fair to say that I'm not even a conscientious student. Until I started preparing for this talk, I hadn't extensively researched the widely available and often expert literature about it. And I'm thinking here of the excellent studies by the likes of Wark and Zielinska and Turpin, my esteemed fellow presenters here, as well as Naomi Klein's programmatic text, which I think is very good, This Changes Everything. Nor had I gone out of my way to locate its effects in nature. Instead, looking back, I was, and to a large extent, I guess I still am, more an accidental scavenger. Someone who cannot but encounter discussions about and effects of the Anthropocene. I might be compared to a man or a woman walking the dog on the beach who treads on washed-up litter every other step and looks down to see what he or she has stepped on. One step, hey, climate change. The next, oh, the last animal of this or that species, and so forth, to the point that a walk on the beach resembles the experience of the walk on a garbage belt. The beach, or the field that I most often stroll, is that of art and of culture, world production more broadly. And what I plan to talk about here today are some of the things that I couldn't help because they were so ubiquitous, because they were so ridiculously and embarrassingly omnipresent, but step on the last few years. So what I present you with, if you will, is a sociocultural history of the soles of my shoe. In his superb study, Anthropocene Fictions, Adam Trexler has argued that the Anthropocene is as much an environmental development, a dodgy one, as it is a cultural transformation. In line with Trexler, my argument is, I guess, that the Anthropocene is also parallel to, though not necessarily a consequence of, socio-ecological developments, what Jameson might have called a cultural dominant. A prevalent structure of feeling, a sentiment, or rather still a mood, shared so widely so as to suggest that it is one of the key characteristics of contemporary culture. To be sure, to say that something is a structure of feeling is by no means the same as to say that it's a distinct stylistic register. Rather, it is a sentiment, or even an attitude, that informs and is expressed by many different styles, regardless of their individual aesthetic differences. In what follows, I first want to explicate what I mean when I say that the Anthropocene is a structure of feeling, or a mood, or something like that. And second, dwelling on examples, some examples, from drawing, performance, installation, and video art, I will speak about two of its related expressions that I have called, and this probably means that either I have too much time on my hands or too little, the algorithm and the new Depth Enos. So, we go to 1, which is the next slide, but not yet the video. Yes. A trip to the beach. That's the title of this bit. For my discussion of the Anthropocene as a structure of feeling or as a mood, I'd like to pick up where I left off. The beach. More specifically, a Seinfeld episode set on the beach. The episode, called The Marine Biologist, from the 5th season. I don't know if any one of you has seen it. I love the episode. I think it's just fantastic. This episode from the 5th season weaves together a number of stories, 2 of which are of interest to us here. In the first of these stories, Jerry Seinfeld's best friend George Costanza, who is at this point, as he is often during the series, miserably unemployed, pretends to be a marine biologist so as to enamor a nature-loving woman. The second story pertains to Jerry's idiosyncratic neighbor, Cosmo Kramer, who's been practicing his golf swing off the New York coast, hitting balls into the ocean. In the final scene, which I'm about to show you, in which the 2 stories are tied into one another, George and his girlfriend are walking on the beach to find a distressed whale stranded on the shores. Trapped in his lie, in which he is a scholar of ocean ecology, a marine biologist, George feels forced to approach the whale to see what is wrong. As he comes close, he quite surprisingly, given that he is not actually a marine biologist, but an idiot, he nonetheless finds out what the problem is.
Save the whale, George. For me.
So I started to walk into the water. I won't lie to you, boys. I was terrified. I pressed on, and as I made my way past the breakers, a strange calm came over me. I don't know if it was divine intervention or the kinship of all living things, but I tell you, Jerry, at that moment, I was a marine biologist.
George, I've just been reading this thing in the paper. It's unbelievable.
I know, I was just telling them the story.
Oh, come on, George, finish the story.
The sea was angry that day, my friends. Like an old man trying to send back soup in a deli. I got about 50 feet out, and suddenly, the great beast appeared before me. I tell you, he was 10 stories high if he was a foot. As if sensing my presence, he let out a great bellow. I said, "Easy, big fella." And then, as I watched him struggling, I realized that something was obstructing its breathing. From where I was standing, I could see directly into the eye of the great fish.
Mammal.
Whatever.
What did you do next?
Well, then, from out of nowhere, a huge tidal wave lifted me, tossed me like a cork, and I found myself right on top of him, face to face with the blowhole. I could barely see from the waves crashing down upon me, but I knew something was there. So I reached my hand in, felt around, and pulled out the obstruction.
What is that, a Titleist? A hole in one, huh?
Seinfeld, in this scene, addresses the Anthropocene, or whatever it was called at that moment, humanity's impact on the world around it, below it, above, between, through, within. That is to say, quite literally, its imprint on the Earth's geology, through at least three distinct tropes. First, the Anthropocene is presented as a joke, as a pun. It is less a tragic reality, for we do not actually see Kramer's golf ball strike the whale, nor do we witness George's rescue, than a story told for laughs. Second, the Anthropocene is an accident, a coincidental effect of a careless but by no means malignant attitude towards nature. It is obvious that Kramer had no intention of hitting a whale. His so-called hole-in-one was as unfortunate as it was unforeseen. At the same time, of course, he wouldn't have struck the whale had he not mindlessly clubbed golf balls into the sea in the first place. And third, the Anthropocene is easily resolved. Even George, an idiot if there ever was one, an unparalleled narcissist, is able to save the whale. And finally, of course, we may also note here that Seinfeld's Anthropocene is white, exclusively white, Western and male. So in short, Seinfeld presents the Anthropocene as a funny mishap which can be straightened out by middle-aged white dudes. I take Seinfeld's approach to the Anthropocene, which I think, especially thanks to Jason Alexander's wonderful acting, is as hilarious as it is disturbing, to be characteristic of the attitude towards environmental problems in the 80s and the 90s. Or, for that matter, economic, political, or moral issues, but it's another question. That is not to say that this approach was the only one, that there weren't any NGOs and individuals ringing alarm bells, that Greenpeace activists weren't roaming the shores on the lookout for whale or for sea hunters, or that there weren't any artists or activists or writers worried about climate change and about rising sea levels, about tsunamis and extinct animals. Indeed, when I posted the question on Facebook, which is all that I do during the day, most of my research takes place there, friends pointed out that numerous examples of text is just that. The art critic Tom Morton proposed Alan Moore's graphic short story Sunburn, which imagines a beach resort on the sun, while philosopher Nina Power reminded me of more or less the entire oeuvre of Ballard. Also, lots of it which is set at the beachfront. Someone like Ursula Le Guin comes to mind, of course, as do Frank Herbert, Philip K. Dick, and Kim Stanley Robinson. However, I would argue that in the 80s and 90s, Seinfeld's moral disinterest, not an immorality as much as an amorality, I guess, was the most common attitude towards the Anthropocene, or whatever it was called. The others at the time were what Williams may have called emergence, peripheral structures of feeling yet to take center stage. Indeed, the very wording of the problems, the Anthropocene, had not yet been formulated. When, with this paper in mind, I returned to the beach 25 years later, I found that its culture had changed beyond compare. George and Kramer had nearly been pushed out of the picture, crowded out by a more environmentally conscious bunch. To be sure, not necessarily better people or worse people, but just people with different things on their minds. I'm referring here above all to the popularization of post-apocalyptic eco-novels and films, ranging from, most recently, Paolo Bacigalupi's The Shipbreaker and Welbeck's The Possibility of an Island, to the filmic adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, in which the chronotype of the beach as a chronotope really, signifies the border between land and between water, as well as between past and future, ruins and air castles, desolation and despair. If Seinfeld's trip to the beach was light-hearted and episodic, contemporary literature, more often than not, arrives there in a grave mood, as its final, destitute destination. It is here or nowhere. And if it is here, I suppose, it's only brief, a last kind of instance, echoing Foucault's final lines in The Word and the Things. Man would be erased like a face drawn at the edge of the sea. But I'm also thinking here of a project like Captain Boomer, which is the next slide. Captain Boomer's 2008 installation, Beached Whale. The Belgium collective created a realistic 17-meter long carcass of a sperm whale covered in blood, smelling of rot, which they installed on Scheveningen Beach and at other beaches later on. A team of actors was hired to play the roles of scientists, examining the mammals, as we just learned from Jerry Seinfeld, cadaver. Seinfeld's white men were still in time to save the whale. But by the time Captain Boomer's men and women in white coats arrived, they could do little more than grieve it. Indeed, their sole function was documentation, the distribution and production of information after the fact. My argument here is twofold. I'm not claiming it to be new in any way. First, I argue, like many others, that in the past decades, our relationship to the environment, to the beach, to the whale, to elsewhere, has gradually come to occupy the center stage of our imagination. To put it in Williams' terms, it has intensified from an emergent structure of feeling to a dominant one. But I guess this much is obvious. More importantly, however, I'd like to argue that the nature of our engagement with the environment has changed. Of course, we've become more serious, but that's not what I'm trying to say. Seinfeld's interaction with the beach's ecosystem was not just humoristic. Its comedy was of a particular register, distinctly object-specific, local, and short-lived. It begins and it ends with a stranded whale. The sentiment in a post-apocalyptic film like The Road, or the installation Beached Whale, in contrast, is objectless, global, and protracted. In The Road, environmentalism is less, far less, I think, a response to a particular problem than, if you allow me to stretch the term, a sort of experiential a priori that informs every other possible problem. Even the point of Beached Whale is less the image of a dead whale than it is the sense of finality that is implied. The plumpness, the solemnity, the blood, the rot, the smell, the scientist documenting after the fact, we're always already too late. Now, it would be a mistake to say that culture has relocated to the beach. Rather, it's the other way around. The beach as a chronotope has moved into culture. The number of novels in which rising sea levels and superstorms have pushed the beach beyond beyond cities like London and New York, has increased exponentially the past decades. And I'm thinking here again of Bacigalupi and Welbeck, but also of the last chapters of far less obvious choices, like T.C. Boyle's A Friend of the Earth, Margaret Atwood's The Year of the Flood, Jennifer Egan's The Goon Squad, or David Mitchell's Bone Clocks. In film, the trope of the retreating coastal line features in anything from the blockbuster disaster flick The Day After Tomorrow, an absolute classic, I think, to the independent eco-community feature, Beasts from the Southern Wild. An interesting example in the art is Olafur Eliasson's 2010 installation series Driftwood. In this project, which I'm not sure was entirely successful, but in this project, the artist distributes driftwood that he collected at the Icelandic coast across Berlin. Placing the weathered wooded pavements at roundabouts, parking areas, and alleys in the city, he both extends and reverses Western culture's romantic relationship to nature. On the one hand, the pieces of driftwood invoke mystery, of origin, of journey, of placing. It poses questions like, where are these pieces of wood from? What do they invoke? On the other hand, the weathered logs also suggest an alternate hierarchy between culture and nature. One where Kramer is no longer hitting golf balls into the ocean, but where the sea has started to pitch them back at us. There's one more, I think. Thank you. What Eliasson's installations imply here is a very different relationship between culture and nature, one in which the latter is not an external obstacle or an incorporated means to an end, but always already an integral part. As Timothy Morton puts it, we coexist. It's just that we've only just realized as much. In his essay, Art and Mood, which is dated but also, I think, really quite brilliant, philosopher Noel Carroll distinguishes between an emotion and a mood. A very basic distinction. An emotion, Carroll writes, is a response to a state of affairs in the world. It is directed towards a particular object, and it tends to be short-lived. If I'm angry, after all, the anger is related to someone or someone who has angered me. I might well depart with my anger if that person apologizes. For example, if I'm angry because my partner has put the organic waste in the regular bin instead of the recycling bin, as we know from Serial Mom, an unforgivable offense, I could shout, you, or I could whisper or think, depending on what kind of relationship I guess you have, or how repressive it is. But I could shout something like, hey, you are killing the planet, you terrible person. And if in response my partner says, oh yeah, of course I'm terrible and I apologize, which is my sort of wet dream of how interactions with people always go, but never do. And so if that would happen, chances are very big that I would forgive that person instantly. An emotion is related, it seems, to an externality that transgresses your affective boundaries, as it were. If it retreats, your harmony may well be restored. A mood, by contrast, Carroll notes, is dependent, and I quote, on the overall state of the organism, on its level of energy, the level of resources at its disposal for coping with environmental challenges, and the degree of tension it finds itself in as a result of the ratio of its resources to its challenges, end quote. What Carroll suggests here is that whereas emotion is the effect of an external transgression of your affective boundaries, mood is the result of an internal, or perhaps rather an internalized disintegration of the affective register. A lack of sleep maybe, or too much sleep, or stress, or relaxation, too little exercise, a lot of exercise, unhealthy food, smoothies, or all of them at the same time, which is a very odd scenario. They disorganize the body's affective automata. Indeed, as Carroll continues, a mood is non-intentional. It is often protracted also. And again, I quote, when I'm irritable, in an irritable mood, there is no one in particular who irritates me. Everyone and everything that falls into my pathway is likely to become the locus of my foul mood, end quote. In this case, the anger I feel towards my partner precedes the waste incident, or, in fact, I guess, the partner, though it may well be exacerbated by either of them. It subsequently will not reside when he or she apologizes. Emotion, Carroll perceptively suggests, cuts through detail, while mood pulls ambient detail into its orbit. And of course, as I imagine you're all now already understanding, I would argue that the difference between Seinfeld and Captain Boomer, between Kramer and the Driftwood, is not quantitative as much as that it is qualitative. Seinfeld presents the Anthropocene, or whatever it was called at that time, as an emotion, oriented, local, and short-lived, informed by a distinct event, a distinct transgression of our affective boundaries. Captain Boomer and Eliasson, in contrast, introduce it as a mood. An objectless or objectlessable, global, protracted sentiment that cannot but inform all other interactions. We no longer need to head out to the beach to experience how we've affected the environment. The beach is always already with us. The golf balls, the whale, the driftwood, invariably on our minds. As Klein writes, and this changes everything, it is nothing less than an existential crisis. And I quote, a fear that comes from living on a planet that is dying, made less alive every day. It is a fear that won't go away, that is because it's a fully rational response to the unbearable reality that we are living in a dying world, a world that a great many of us are helping to kill. Good. Not good, of course, but that is the idea of the Anthropocene as a mood. And what I want to do next is to discuss briefly two kind of sensibilities or tropes, or whatever you want to call them, that have been popping up really enormously often in the arts over the past 2 decades. The algorithm, I'm super sorry for that name, but I'll explain it, and I imagine it doesn't really need much explaining. and then new Depth Enos. The Anthropocene mood manifests itself in many ways, many more in any case than I will mention here, or indeed that I imagine I know of. I want to focus on two indirect expressions briefly that I've written about in more and less detail elsewhere in very different contexts, and that I would like to develop further here in the light of the Anthropocene. The algorithm and the new Depth Enos. And although these two are very different from one another, I think they also overlap, or perhaps one presupposes the other, or something like that. I haven't really figured it out. The first of these, the insufficiently titled algorithm, takes its name from the words alternative, obviously, signifying the possibility of a state of affairs that is different from the one at hand, and algorithm, a set of autonomous rules informing a computation, often used in mathematics, coding, risk assessment, and above all, speculation. Indeed, I use the term algorithm to refer to those practices that envisage alternative, often impossible scenarios through precisely the algorithmic modeling. Or rather still, perhaps, algorithms that challenge the natural laws of probability. The trope of the algorithm, as I see it, is a reaction to two overlapping processes. The first of these is an environment that spins ecologically, economically, and politically beyond our control. You might call this the return of history with a capital H, but the Anthropocene, or indeed the Capitalocene, suggesting a correlation between the ecological state and the capitalist condition, may just be as appropriate or even more appropriate a label. The second process that it responds to is what Ulrich Beck has referred to famously and a long time ago as the risk society. Modern culture's tendency to use algorithms, codes, and simulations to predict and preempt, very important, preempt the possible outcomes of existing processes. A pilot in training, for instance, might use a flight simulator to test his abilities to respond to all possible scenarios. An investment banker might develop an algorithm to speculate on the price of a stock. An insurance company calculates the costs, the chance of accidents, illnesses, and deaths. And during the First Gulf War, as Baudrillard has famously argued, the US Army premeditated all of the above, playing out a play scripted to the comma without the consent and at the cost of its enemy or other player. What the algorithm responds to, in other words, is the extent to which the first process is the antithesis, or perhaps rather indicates the failure of the latter. The return of history is that scenario that either wasn't predicted by algorithms or, more likely, that the decoders just didn't want to read. What I mean then by algorithm is a map of an actual future emerging from a virtual present, as opposed to the algorithm which is used for the mapping of virtual futures within the parameters of an actual present. The algorithm is the name for the practice in the arts or elsewhere that uses the algorithm, code, or simulation to develop scenarios that will more likely than not, or simply cannot, happen, or that question what may and may not happen. It pertains to artworks that plot unlikely trajectories from uncertain and often unstable points of departure. To put it in other words, the Anthropocene's algorithm posits an as-if statement, whereas the risk society used to pose a what-if question. As the early 20th century, I would say very odd philosopher Hans Weihinger has argued, the conjunctor as if is an analogy as with a conditional if, a comparison with an unstable other. It is an equation in which not only the variables change, but also the constants. If you treat one scenario as if it were another, regardless of the relationship between these two, you open up the terms of the debate entirely. You shift language, often in ridiculous terms. The Dutch artist Jonas Staal, for example, who I imagine many of you will be familiar with, who has done lots here, I think, and is about to do something here again. That artist, by discussing politics as if it were art, raises entirely new questions and alternate answers. Many of these Q&As will, when translated back to politics, make no sense. But some may just help rethink what politics is and can be. The risk society's what-if questions, in contrast, close down. A Shell scenario planning division, Shell, of course, one of the first companies to famously engage in future planning, trend watching, and all that shit. Shell explains on their website, Shell, and I quote, Shell scenarios ask what if questions, to explore alternative views of the future and create plausible stories around them. They consider long-term trends in economics, energy supply and demand, geopolitical shifts and social change, as well as the motivating factors that drive that change. In doing so, they help build visions of the future. End quote. What-if questions, in other words, calculate all possible routes one might take from his or her current position. What happens, they ask, when you go left here, and then right again, and then left, and maybe then left? Like in that song, Kendrick Lamar, I think, has a song where he does that. Or, where does this road lead? The artistic trope of the algorithm, on the other hand, acts as if a scenario could take place, or especially if it knows that it cannot. So the what-if question says, let's see what can take place. The algorithm, the as-if statement says, let's act as if something can happen which we know it cannot. The point of the algorithm, indeed, seems less to predict the future than to think to extend the possibilities of the present. As you might expect from digital code, the algorithm's as-if statement often spells out an alter or non-human presence. Unsurprisingly, the algorithm is particularly pervasive in the genre or sensibility, however we want to call it, of art often referred to as post-internet. Those practices relating in one way or another, logic, aesthetic, mode of production, distribution or consumption, to the internet and its effect on contemporary culture. Indeed, in thinking about the algorithm, I think I'm above all thinking of the projects of artists like Ed Atkins, Alexandra Domanovic, Katja Novitskaya, Ian Chang, Timur Sikin, Monica Stricker, and the likes. That's all I have written down. I imagine there's many more. In Ed Atkins' video performance, one of which is on a still here, a digital avatar modeled after the artist holds forth monologues, which is Atkins' recorded voice, about the meaning of life. In stark contrast to the avatars of role-playing games, of simulation games, however, the avatar here is not the double enacting his organic counterpart's intended narrative as much as an inadequate placeholder for his incoherent subconscious, if we can use that term at all, lost from its proper locus, the human body. Now hybrids, bodies without genitals, then disembodied, a head isolated in the dark, a head shrinking, a head deflating like hot air, talking from a digital realm but with an analog voice to everyone and to no one in particular and never a response in sight. Atkins' avatars intersperse incomprehensible ramblings with the grandest of theories, casual smoking and drinking with heartfelt declarations of love, and even, in his latest installation in the Serpentine, Ribbons, intensely performed love songs of Randy Newman and Bach. The simulation here does not present a scenario of a possible future or anything of the likes, but a post-human stream of consciousness of the present that raises questions about both the sustainability of that present and the possibility of any future story at all. And in Ian Chang's video loop Entropy Wrangler from 2013, a post-human digital stream of consciousness is also envisaged. Yet where for Atkins post-human means a situation that is alter-human, Chang literally imagines a past-human plot, one where no humans interfere with the action. Chang has developed an algorithm that replicates unpredictably. One time, one thing happens, the other time, a completely different story. The point of departure, a given, always the same point, is a virtual display of an undefined space filled with a chair, a ball, sorry, this is the next picture, a ball, and lots of other stuff, like you see some still on it. A hand, there is, I think, a panther, all kinds of different beasts and things are in there. At press, when the artist presses the button so the performance starts, the objects begin, on the basis of the algorithm, begin to evolve, each time differently, sometimes moving into each other, sometimes away, then cracking the chair, now breaking the figure, and so on. The algorithm takes into account some laws of nature, but not all, causing scenarios which are decidedly improbable, as well as being irrational in that there is no logical, that is to say, no humanly conceivable, reason for their coming into being. What Chang's algorithm achieves is an imagination that supersedes the human mind, and that it is conceived independent from human interference, and that it doesn't follow from the human rationale. Yet that in turn will obviously inform the human's creative capabilities. And I just want to say, I mean, I'm reducing these works. I mean, these works are both of them so incredibly rich. And so I'm reducing two works to this very singular kind of reading, which is obviously terrible. There's more to them than I'm saying here. What these admittedly isolated examples of Atkins and Chang, for there are many other case studies possible, what they show is a desire in the arts to produce models that first relate to the possibility of a world that develops differently with or even independently from human interaction, and second, that utilize technocratic and techno-capitalist models of prediction to envisage these alternative scenarios that defy all prediction. The point here seems less a plea for a world without humans or anything, but a world where humans are able to consider options other than the ones stemming from their own localized embodied brains. Options that may well support those humans' opportunities for survival. And in this sense, I guess, the algorithm in the arts does not have to look far for its philosophical counterparts. New materialism and, to an extent, speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. How much? I have one bit more. Do I have some time?
I think so.
Yeah?
Can you hold it? I think this is so much fun. Yes, finish.
Yes, good. I said sometime. I have an hour left, so you're sitting here for a while. So 3. I have, yeah, no, I'm almost done. 3, which is the new Depth Enos. So, I want to conclude kind of by briefly mentioning one other development in the arts that seems to me to express the mood of the Anthropocene, and that is present in and overlaps with the trope of the algorithm, the new Depth Enos. And again, I'm so sorry for these names. I was trained by Henk Oosterling, the king of making up words, and so apparently I started doing it myself as well. The new Depth Enos is the name that I have used in a somewhat speculative and very erratic essay in Efflux to those practices which, after postmodernism obscured, flattened and hollowed out epistemological notions of depth, that they propose a performative depth, a depth whose parameters cannot be ascertained but are imagined anyway so as to imbue the present with a new sense of meaning. Depth Enos here is a contraction, obviously, of Frederick Jameson's notion of the new depthlessness and Stephen Colbert's joke about truthiness, the verification of truth not via empirical facts or logical reasoning, but the gut feeling. Remember, Stephen Colbert does this thing with Bush, where Bush says, I don't know, I have no facts that there's any weapons in Iraq, but my gut feeling says there are, and so I can bomb the hell out of these guys. And Stephen Colbert then has this entire riff that goes on and on about truthiness, which is very funny, but also very telling, I think. There is depth in the Depth Enos, and yet there isn't in the sense in which we have hitherto understood depth. It's another kind of depth. In the essay on which this little talk is based, I distinguish, taking my lead from the Italian critic and novelist Alessandro Bariccio, between 3 models of engagement. The diver and the surfer, which are from Bariccio, and, creative as I am, the snorkeler. The diver is Bariccio's metaphor for Jameson's depth model. He spots a dark spot on the ocean's surface, presumes it is an indication, that is, an index, a symptom, an expression of an underlying treasure, and dives as deep as he has to on that one single spot until he has found the treasure. The surfer is Bariccio's metaphor for postmodernism, or at least Jameson's postmodernism, its perceived depthlessness. He moves across the surface, catching wave after wave, in order precisely to not fall into the water, in order not to go under. The water is still there, the depth is still there. It's not that it's entirely gone, but it's become the purpose not to experience the depth, not to be a part of it. Like in Warhol, you're being constantly shoved off the surface. He doesn't want you to go under it. He's constantly pushing you back, or like Koons with the rabbit. Like, you know, it's reflecting your image. So you're constantly being pushed back by these surfaces. It's not that they're not there, we just don't know how they are anymore. Just as Jameson, oh no, and there's the snorkeler. The snorkeler, finally, my own slightly silly contribution, is the metaphor for an attitude currently in vogue. You float just below the surface, but look downwards towards the ocean's depth, intuiting depth rather than experiencing empirically. Just as Jameson distinguishes between Van Gogh and Warhol, and Bariccio compares reading Proust or Joyce to web browsing, I also have particular snorkelers in mind. The aforementioned Atkins and Domanovic, definitely, as well as the likes of Annemette Hall, Mark Leckey, who I think may, in retrospect, become to be seen as one of the key figures, really, in contemporary art. Andy Holden, Katie Holton, Oscar Santillon, and Django Hernandez. In Santillon's Zephyr, which this is a still from, for instance, the artist links together matter-of-factly in a coherent, though unlikely narrative, stories, activities, and objects that have no relation to one another whatsoever. The artist informs us, without verifying its truth in a sort of Sebald kind of way, that the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, as a young man, longed to see jaguars in Ecuador. Unfortunately, Jung never got to fulfill his desires. The artist then takes up this task a century later by traveling to Ecuador, his home country, with a vacuum cleaner, with which he, after consulting with a shaman who points him to the place where jaguars supposedly always roam and spread their air, their scent, sucks in the scent of the jaguar. I think this is the next slide. So he has this idea of Jung, and he models then a birthstone, which is this sort of, I don't know, like a paranormal kind of thing that Jung had. He makes it as well. And he puts that birthstone into a vacuum cleaner. He goes to Ecuador, asks the shaman, where should I best, find the jaguars and their scent? The shaman says, hey, you should go there. The artist goes there, sucks in the scent of the jaguar in this vacuum cleaner, into this little box, and then belatedly, Jung's desires are fulfilled, beyond the grave, as it were, by this paranormal activity of this birthstone or birth chart or whatever it is. Was that clear? Sort of. So this is what happens in this work. The story, I guess, performs depth precisely because the artist treats each object precisely as it is intended, whilst at the very same time, through their linkage, suggesting capacities that far extend their normal usage. Jung was definitely a mystic, but was this part of his fascination? A vacuum cleaner sucks in dust, but can it hold a scent? Santillon intimates depth that he acknowledges, through the uncommonness of the activity, may well not be real. But he performs them nonetheless, or perhaps precisely because of that understanding, in order to re-signify, to make meaningful for him the life that he lives amidst all of these things and processes. Santillon is only one example of a generation of artists interested in rewriting grand narratives that imbue each of its individual, separate semantic elements with the possibility, but not the certainty, of many meanings. Others here are Mark Leckey, Django Hernandez, and Andy Holden, but other artists like Katie Holton create an intimation of depth by drawing out the similarities between natural phenomena like starscapes with road maps, suggesting a hidden pattern, a secret motive at the core of all these matters, whilst yet others, such as Domanovic, perform it by creating illusions of continuity. To conclude, and this is really the conclusion, the point I wish to make here is not that either the algorithm or the new depthiness is a direct consequence of the Anthropocene mood, or even that they are exclusive to it. Far from it. If I had wanted to discuss such manifestations, I could have easily chosen more suitable ones, such as tropes that explicitly mention erupting volcanoes, flooding, extinction, etc., or eco-conscious fashion, or locally produced food, or something along those lines. My argument is rather that the mood of the Anthropocene, the global, objectless, protracted existential crisis caused by the organism's incapacity to relate to the world around it, informs sentiments such as the algorithm and the new depthiness, that filter through in many of these distinct narratives about flooding and eco-conscious fashion, but that also filter through in many other artworks that have nothing to do with the Anthropocene, at least not on first sight. I would argue that the mood helps inspire and can also be read from such attempts to think beyond the parameters of what we currently understand. For if the Anthropocene has made anything clear, is that our current understanding of how the world works or should work has led to an increasingly disastrous scenario of the future. I went snorkeling once on a holiday. I wanted to dive to look for the resources, corals or something like it, but I couldn't because I was born with a slight heart condition. The depth might literally kill me. Surfing, the exploitation of resources for the sake of fun, again of corals, the co-creators of the surf, I lacked the skills for. So I went snorkeling. which I guess is in many ways the loser's water sports. And I'm apologizing if there's any snorkelers out here. The activity you engage in if there is nothing else you're able to do. Maybe it's a bit like academia. So it's academia and snorkeling, I guess. As I was floating just below the surface, looking at the incredible fish and plants below me, I felt both very heavy and very light. And this is going to be a bit corny, so please indulge me here. This was better when I was writing it down, and now it looks a bit ridiculous. In any case, I felt light because for very long periods I didn't have to move at all. It was almost, I remember thinking, as if I wasn't there at all. However, I also felt very heavy because my body, floating in the currents, kept steering me towards corals and rocks, forcing me to act, to swim around those rocks, to bend my body around those corals, to move up a notch. In order to be light, then to be absent, in other words, I had to come to terms with my fundamental heaviness rather than abnegate it. I couldn't, like the beach, because like the beach, the heaviness was always already with me. So I had to act. I was feeling, you might say, light and heavy, absent and present, unaware and very aware, without direction but not lost, in place and yet without firm position. I was feeling rather Anthropocene. Good, that was it, thank you.